Thank you for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. If you would click subscribe, and if you would click that you like it and ring the little bell to ring and give you notice when we're having a video, I'd really appreciate it. It would help me out. I need to get 1,000 subscribers to get pushed out by YouTube, and so it'll take everybody helping me to get there. We're going to talk about you can't preach here. And so I went to a church and I didn't look like they wanted me to look. So the pastor said, well, you can't preach. And I'll tell you what happened. I got there and the pastor called me on the phone about 2 weeks prior to that. He said, I heard that you preached for Brother so-and-so at his church, 3-night revival. I said, yes, I did. He goes, well, he highly recommended you. We have a lot of young married couples. We have a lot of singles. And you're a young preacher, and I'd like you to come preach Sunday morning, Sunday night at my church. I said, okay. He goes, kind of short notice. He goes, could you be there in 2 weeks? And I looked on my book. I said, yeah. And it wound up being 3 because I was booked that weekend. I told him, I said, I'm booked both of the next Sundays, and the 2 after I only have 1. So he said, come then. I'll let everybody know you're coming, and you'll enjoy our church. We run about 150, 200, and a lot of young people. I said, okay. So I showed up about 20 minutes before the service. It was like 40 miles from my house. And I walked in, and I shook. There were 7 or 8 men standing there just inside the door. I shook a couple of their hands, and they said, who are you? And I said, I'm the guest speaker that's going to be preaching. And the pastor said to me, he goes, and I held my hand out to shake his hand. He wouldn't shake my hand. And I said, something wrong? He goes, would you mind coming in my office? And it was real snippy. I was like, well, I wonder what I did wrong. All I did was walk in the door and stick my hand out to shake it. So we went in his office, and 2 of those guys went in with us. I assume they were elders. And he said, I can't have you preaching in my church looking like that. And I was like, looking like what? You know, I'm wearing a suit and a tie and dress boots. And he said, your hair and you got a Fu Manchu mustache. You've got long sideburns that come down like Elvis. And he said, your hair's touching your collar. And he said, you can't preach in my church looking like that. He goes, if I'd have known that, I'd have never invited you to come and preach. And I said, well, I'm sorry. I said, I don't mean to offend you. I said, but the other gentleman I preached for was just fine. He goes, well, he made a lot of that in his pulpit, but I don't. I said, okay. He said, I wished I'd have known this. I said, well, I didn't know I was supposed to give you a description of me. You called, you were talking to a pastor friend. He casually mentions that someone preached. They had a good meeting. You talked to him about it. You give my phone number. You call me. I come. And now you tell me I'm not presentable. I said, I did take a shower. I am wearing a 3-piece suit. I do have a tie on, and I'm ready to go. He goes, not in my pulpit. You can't preach in my church. I said, okay. I said, evidently it's your church, not God's church. Let me give you this scripture here in Samuel 16:7. It says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his height or of his stature. God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And I opened my Bible and read him that scripture. And I turned it around for him to look. He wouldn't look at it. He said, I know that scripture. I said, then, why don't you do what Jesus said? Don't worry about the outside of a person. Look at the inside. Nope, you're not getting up. I don't want my young people looking like you. And I said, okay. I said, well, brother, I appreciate it. I will leave. I don't want to cause trouble. And I stuck my hand out to shake his hand. He wouldn't shake my hand. I said, sir, you're a minister of Christ, and I'm offering you my handshake and telling you I'm sorry that you don't like the way I look. I'm going to leave, and you won't even shake my hand. Do you think that's a good spirit to have, to be bitter, hateful, about take my head off? You've been talking to me really rough ever since I walked in the door. I said, it just isn't right. I said, well, you'll answer to God and I'll answer to God. And I went out and got in my car, and I drove I think it was about 40 miles. I drove it back to my home church where my parents was at, and their church, and I walked in, and they had just started preaching, And when we got done, my mom came back. She said, "What are you doing here? I thought you was preaching over in Illinois at this church." I said, "Well," I told her what happened. She was, "You got to be kidding." I said, "Nope." He gave me the hook, you know. And I said, I asked him when I went out the door, I said, it'd been nice if you'd have just said, "You're welcome to stay for the service. We'd like to have you here, but you just can't preach." It wasn't that. He went and opened the door and showed me the door. So you can't preach in this church. I ran into that, and it kind of shocked me at first. But when I got married to my wife 2 or 3 years later, about 4 or 5 months after we got married, I'd already preached at maybe 12 churches during that time. I had a booking, another one. Guy called me, said, I talked to a preacher. He said, "You preached a 5-night revival for him. It went real well. Could you preach Sunday morning, Sunday night?" We made a date. I don't know if it was 2 weeks, 5 weeks, but it wasn't too far out. And I went to his church, and when I got in there, his same thing. "You can't preach here. Your hair, your Fu Manchu mustache, your sideburns, and all that." And I said, "Brother," I said, "in the late 1800s, early 1900s, almost every man had a mustache. Most of them had fairly long hair. It wasn't down to here, but they had pretty fairly long hair. There wasn't a barber shop on every corner." And I said, you look at some of these mining pictures of my father and the men that worked in the mine, there's only just a small percentage, 10 or 15% of the guys that don't have a mustache or sideburns or long hair or whatever. I said, my great grandfather, I got a picture of him at home, and he looks like Wild Bill Cody. He's got the white beard that comes to a point here, and his hair touches his collar, and he's sitting there, and he was from England. And I said he was a distinguished fellow and a well-respected person in his community. I said, this is just man-made rules that they came up with in the early 1900s when all these church organizations started. And I said, okay. I said, I'll leave, Same thing. He didn't say, "Why don't you stay? You can be here at the service." And, he invited me to sing and preach. And he could have said, "Why don't you sing a song or two?" But no, I couldn't be on his platform because of the way I looked. And so I left, and my wife started crying. We got outside. I said, "Honey, don't cry." She was, "I can't believe they're doing this to you." I said, "They're not doing it to me. They're doing it to the Lord." I said, she goes, "Are you going to have to give a description of yourself every time somebody calls you don't know you?" I said, "I don't know. I guess I'll start warning people, that I look so bad. I'm going to put this picture on here for you, and you can decide for yourself if I looked good, bad, or ugly, or whatever." But it was just a bad thing. And he said, "You can't preach here." And the other pastor told me the same thing. "You can't preach here." So, you run into all sorts of prejudice. And if you're going to preach at different churches, different faiths, things happen. Then my wife and I went to another church, and I was preaching. And I walked in. It was about 60 miles from our house. So I couldn't just hop, skip home. We were probably 20 miles, 25 miles from home. And I discovered I didn't have a tie. I always put the tie on at the last minute. I hated wearing a tie. Somebody in my past must have died dancing at the end of a rope because I didn't like stuff around my neck. So we got there, and I had a 3-piece suit on: vest, coat, slacks, dress boots. I always wore boots, and I didn't have a tie. So we went in. I went up on the platform. He wanted me to sing. So back in the late 70s, a lot of people didn't have tape decks. I took my tape deck and I plugged it in a PA system, worked with a sound man. I was going to sing some soundtracks with my wife. And he come up there and he goes, "Can you come here a minute?" And I thought, oh boy, here it goes again, because he acted like he was mad. So I went to him. I said, "Yes, sir." And he goes, I said, "I'm Randy May." He shook my hand. And he said, "You can't preach on my platform." I thought, oh boy. But he said it wasn't my hair. I wasn't wearing a tie. He said, you got to wear a tie. Nobody can preach without wearing a tie. You just got to wear a tie. He said, "Why would you wear a suit and not have a tie?" I said, "Well, I'll be honest with you. We were in a hurry, and we've got a little baby, and we had to put a car seat in, and I had to put my soundtracks in and my tape deck. I had to go to the church and get it." And I said, we were about 25, 30 miles from home. I discovered I didn't have a tie. I don't put a tie on until I get to the church. "You don't put it on at home?" I go, "No, I'm driving 60 miles. No, I don't need to wear a tie when I'm driving in my car." I said, "So, no, I don't." I said, I forgot to bring a tie. He goes, you come with me. So I went with him, and he talked one of his ushers or his elders, whoever it was. He took his tie off, and they gave it to me, and I went into the bathroom, got in front of the mirror, and tied the tie, and put it on. And his church was air conditioned, but it was really warm in there. And we got up on a platform, and they wanted us to sing 4 or 5 songs. They said, well, they gave me ample time. They didn't drag the service out. So we were up there singing. The platform stood about 3 or 4 feet higher than the people in the congregation. Then they were sitting down. I was standing up. I'm 6'2", so I'm 10 or 11 feet higher than them. It was hot. You could feel the hot air. And I was sweating real bad. And unfortunately, I've done that all my life. I sweat a lot when I get hot. And so while I was preaching, I loosened my tie. And then while I was preaching, I got so hot, I took my coat off and hung it on a mic stand. And I kept preaching. Pretty soon I told everybody, would you stretch your hands forth for a minute here? And so everybody in the congregation stretched your hands forth. I took that tie off and held it up, and I said, now everybody do this. And everybody did that, and I said, bye-bye, tie, and I tossed that thing, and I went on preaching. We had a good service. I preached the sermon not wearing a tie. And he never said nothing after I got done. So evidently putting it on and getting up there was just enough to keep myself out of trouble not wearing a tie. Aren't you glad that God doesn't come down and nitpick with you like that and worry about if your sideburns are here, or if you even have them, or how you wear your hair? I realize that was back in the 70s. We're living in 2023. I understand that. But everybody has their own prejudice and preconceived ideas. They think how things should be. And that doesn't mean that they're always right about things. But when you're a guest speaker in a church, you know, when in Rome, do what the Romans do, and that's what you have to do. So I didn't get to preach without putting a tie on. Man-made rules. And then we used to have the preachers that clothesline preachers. You know, they beat women up all the time. Don't wear jewelry, don't wear makeup, wear your dress down to here and all that. And then they'd run off with the piano player, you know, and leave their wife. I actually knew 2 preachers that married the piano player and ran off and left their wife. And they were real hard on women about how they dressed. You know, my dad wasn't, and I never was a clothesline preacher. I mean, you ought to dress modestly, but I'm not going to stand at the back door with a tape measure measuring your length of your dress and all this stuff. And they rarely beat up on guys, but they beat up on women all the time. And so we need to realize what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We have to understand that God doesn't want us hating people. He doesn't want us being mad at people. He doesn't want us doing things that we shouldn't do. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 14 through 16, it says, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Basically what they're saying here, boiled down to it, is better for a woman to have long hair, better for a man to have short hair in some instances. But if it's going to cause friction and contention, we have no other practice, nor does the church of God. Throw it out the window. It's not worth fighting over, but some people just can't let things go. And let me tell you about the Bible days real quick. It said about long hair, it was for coverings. Paul said it was believers, and some people behaved in an honorable way in their culture, some didn't. Hair on a man was considered appropriate. Long hair was with a lot of cultures, and it was considered masculine to have long hair in a lot of cultures back in that day. And in Corinth, it was a sin because male prostitutes that prostituted themselves at the pagan temples wore long hair. Women who wore short hair were prostitutes. But that was that culture. Other cultures, their rules were just the opposite. So, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Paul was saying you should avoid the appearance of bad behavior, and we should be a good witness for Christ. But how you wear your hair in this day and age and in your culture is up to you. If you're in a country somewhere else other than the United States and they have a culture about it, then you know your own culture. But here, I tell you what, now I don't have to worry about it no more. But I'm telling you, God didn't like it. You can't preach at this church. So if you never heard nothing like that, you did today. I heard those 2 times, and then the tie thing. There were a couple, 3 more, but I didn't bring all of them in. I want to make this thing a half hour long. But I just want to tell you that we've got to be able to look at people. God looks at the outside. Doesn't look at the outside. He looks at the heart. The man looks at the outside. And so we have to realize that. I'm going to read this verse one more time and we'll close. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't look at the appearance or the height or the stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I'm telling you, I've seen some people go to church carrying their 16-pound Bible, and the woman have long hair with a big beehive on the top, and the guy wear a 3-piece suit with a tie, and his hair's cut like a military haircut. And they were mean people. They were people you didn't want to be around. They were hateful and everything else. Just because you dress up the outside, it's what's on the inside that counts. The Lord looks at your heart. And aren't you glad that he does, and that he's going to be our judge, not these preachers at these churches. But, and I realize a pastor's got to keep control of his own church, do what he thinks is best and all that. I never argued with any of them. I left when they didn't want me to preach. But let me tell you something. Let's don't look so much at the person on the outside, but let's look at what's on the inside. Because what's on the inside is eventually going to come out to the outside. And so you want to have God within you. I love you. Thank you for your time. This time, till next time, so long.